welcome everyone. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to hand over to Abdullah now.
Mesdames et messieurs, merci d'être venus. Nous sommes donc à la deuxième session de cette série de webinaires de la Convention d'Abidjan portant sur l'élaboration des plans d'action portant sur la pollution plastique.
Sorry, Abdullah.
Dans la région de la Convention d'Abidjan. Hier, non, il y a 2 jours, nous avons reçu en session d'ouverture le secrétaire exécutif de la Convention d'Abidjan, M. Abou Bamba, qui nous a expliqué un peu que la Convention d'Abidjan allait jouer dans le développement de ces plans d'action-là.
Mediterranean area.
Alors, je ne m'entends plus, je ne sais pas si on m'entend toujours.
We can no longer hear him. It's like his sound has gone. Can you let him know in the box? Okay.
C'est la deuxième session qui va recevoir le professeur Linda Godfrey, qui sera introduite tout à l'heure par Tony Ribink. Ces sessions-là sont conduites dans le cadre d'un projet qui s'appelle ACP MEAs, financé par l'Union européenne.
Firstly, welcome everybody to this second session, and we're very fortunate today to have Linda Godfrey, whom I've got the pleasure of introducing. Nous
avons une présentation sur cette série de
action plans for management of plastic waste in Africa. And I'm very proud that Linda has joined us. Professor Godfrey is arguably one of the most knowledgeable people on the continent on the management of plastic waste in Africa, in fact, all solid waste. And she was a lead author in the African Waste Management Outlook. And that is a wonderful book. If those of you who are listening here haven't read it, you certainly should, because it gives us tremendous pointers on the way forward. In addition to that, she was highly instrumental in developing the Waste Research Development and Innovation Roadmap for South Africa. And in many respects, that is also like an action plan, sharing a number of similarities and features. So this is tremendous, because she's in a wonderful position to provide guidance. Not only is she, as indicated in the document that you have on her, the principal scientist at the CSIR, but she's also internationally recognized well beyond Africa, gives lectures all around the world. And we're fortunate indeed to have Professor Linda Godfrey with us today. In addition to her work in these aspects, she has also pioneered and been highly instrumental in developing postgraduate education within
des publications au niveau des universités sud-africaines et qui ont pu frayer leur chemin dans le monde universitaire. Donc, nous lui sommes infiniment reconnaissants et nous attendons impatiemment à recevoir, vous connaissez. Merci.
It's wonderful to be with you today, and I look forward to the discussions, and I'm hoping that by now you can all see my presentation. If not, I'm hoping that someone will shout.
It is up. It is looking lovely.
Fantastic, thank you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about this particular issue in terms of the challenge of plastic waste management in Africa. And what I'd like to do today is to place this issue, plastic waste management, within the context of the broader waste management situation in Africa, because I think that plastic waste is a very useful indicator of the state of waste management and also broader municipal services in a city or in a town or in a country. So managing for plastic waste means effectively that we actually need to be managing for solid waste in general. So I'm going to use that as a frame of reference for this presentation. I also want to place plastic waste management within the context of the key findings of the Africa Waste Management Outlook. The first Africa Waste Management Outlook was published by UNEP back in 2018.
Waste Management Outlook. Et la première, le premier document que nous avons précité, qui a été publié par le PNUE, fut le 5 juin 2018. Et cette perspective porte essentiellement sur un certain nombre de choses, notamment un certain nombre d'États. Nous parlons également de l'État solide des déchets et notamment leur gestion, aussi la gouvernance des déchets, les répercussions des déchets en Afrique, les déchets considérés en tant que ressources et des solutions idoines à l'échelle de l'Afrique et plus important encore, la gestion des déchets sur le plan financier. Et puisqu'il s'agit d'un problème financier et économique, et cela traite également des aspects financiers. Donc, si vous n'avez pas eu l'opportunité de rencontrer l'équipe de Africa Waste Management Outlook, et donc, je pense que cela vaut le détour et la manière dont nous allons traiter cette question. Alors que maintenant, je vais vous faire parcourir les différents chapitres de ce document qui va nous servir de guide au moment où nous discutons des défis liés à la gestion des déchets. Tout d'abord, nous savons que l'Afrique en tant que continent est également
Century. We know that population, we see a growing middle class and consumer purchasing habits that will change. And these drivers are expected to lead to exponential growth in waste management, in waste generation. In fact, so much so that this growth of waste generation in Africa is expected to essentially overshadow anything else that actually might be happening in terms of trying to reduce waste in other regions of the world. And if we look, for example, at this particular diagram from the Global Waste Management Outlook, you can see the dotted line, at least for sub-Saharan Africa, you can see the significant increase in total municipal solid waste generation over the coming decades. And so we know that we're going to have increasing volumes of waste generated on the back of a very shaky foundation when it comes to waste management. So this further burdens the current services, waste management services, and current waste infrastructure that we have in place on the ground on the continent. If we look at the state of solid waste management, so where are we? The Africa Outlook provides us with an indication in terms of the composition of waste. What are the types of waste that we're dealing with? It looks at waste collection coverage, the state of waste disposal, the level of recycling, and also importantly, a growing issue is this issue of transboundary movement of waste. And so I want to use these 5 different themes to talk about this issue of the challenges of plastic waste management. Now, I always love to do this through photos because I think a photo tells a much better story than words. But certainly, if we look at this first one around the composition of waste, we're seeing a significant change in the types of waste that are being generated on the continent. We certainly see more plastic usage and more single-use plastic usage. The amount of plastic waste that is being generated is increasing at an unprecedented rate on the continent. And certainly photos like this after a heavy rainfall event, we see the impact of plastic. And as I said, plastic is a very visible indicator of a broader problem around solid waste management. Also, in terms of the composition of waste, we know that on average, plastic makes up around about 13% of the municipal solid waste stream, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, and that figure is increasing. So again, as we have a growing middle class, as consumption patterns change, there's a greater shift towards the use of plastic and other packaging, and we expect this percentage figure to increase going forward. So we expect more and more of a burden in terms of plastic waste management within the solid waste management system. We also see a number of new types of products emerging on our markets, products for which we know there is no appropriate end-of-life solution. In this particular photo, these are disposable nappies or diapers, which are being disposed of in the community by trying to burn them. You can see the photos where part of it is caught alight, but they don't, obviously, they haven't burned completely. And so again, you end up with this plastic waste. In this case, this was just dumped in an open area because there was no end-of-life solution.
Ça a été jeté dans une décharge sauvage et parce qu'il n'y a pas vraiment un lieu qui a été techniquement aménagé en vue de traiter ce type de déchets. Vu l'apparition de nouveaux projets, de nouveaux produits qui sont créés, donc cela va poser un certain nombre de problèmes au niveau de la gestion des déchets par les municipalités. Et donc, s'agissant maintenant de la couverture, de la collecte.
Estimated at around about 55%, but that figure differs greatly. We have some cities and towns on the continent where waste collection is at less than 20%. We have others where the collection rate exceeds 80%. But more and more, we're seeing this issue around growing volumes of waste that are not collected. And as we see in the photo here, again, you can see the plastic mixed in with the other types of waste, very often a lot of organic waste. This waste then becomes available, whether it be through flooding or through a rainfall event or through windblown litter. This waste, and in particular the plastic, is essentially moved into the environment. We also know that approximately 90% of the waste generated in Africa is disposed of to land, and typically on the continent that disposal is to uncontrolled or controlled dump sites. We have very few engineered sanitary landfill sites on the continent, despite there being a strong move to transitioning away from uncontrolled and controlled dump sites to engineered landfills. And again, as you can see in the photo here, a significant amount of plastic that's being just disposed of. There is no daily compaction, there's no cover of the waste, and very often this light plastic at least simply blows into the environment. Again, you know, the lack of access to sites, particularly as we see in our rural communities, very often just results in the dumping of waste, not even in a controlled dump site, but just in the open land. And again, you know, causing potential hazards to communities, health risks to communities, and also to the environment. In terms of the level of recycling, we estimate that only around 4% of waste is actually recycled on the African continent. So this results in the loss of resources in terms of different African economies. And typically what we find is that recyclables will cherry pick the high value recyclables, and they'll leave the problematic or the low value plastics, and which are then disposed of, as we've seen in the previous slides. Those low value or non-recyclable plastics are then disposed of to dump sites. Again, why it's so important that we actually design products as well for recycling to deal with this issue. Also, in terms of the level of recycling, we know that on the continent, as in most developing countries around the world, the informal waste sector plays a very valuable role in terms of recovering recyclables from waste streams. Typically, this is from the dump sites themselves. And again, if you just look at that photo, you can just see the amount of plastic that is sitting in this dump site. But obviously, informal reclaimers can only access, you know, what is at the surface of the dump site and what they can get their hands on. But a very important link between the service chain and the value chain of helping to grow recycling. This issue of transboundary movement of waste, as I said, it's becoming a bigger issue. We've seen it quite a lot in terms of electronic waste management, particularly in West Africa, but we're also starting to see more and more plastic waste also being dumped into the African continent, whether it be legally or illegally, because of countries in the Asia-Pacific region closing their borders to transboundary movement. So developed countries are looking to do something with their plastic waste. And I always say waste flows from a country with strong regulation to a country with weak regulation. And so that's why it's so important that we also put the appropriate regulations and the appropriate policy in place to deal with these transboundary movements. If we then look at the impacts of waste management, if we look at the impacts of plastic waste management, we know that waste is having significant social, economic, and environmental impacts on the African continent. We also know that the cost of inaction, the cost of doing nothing, is significant. And so it really is critical that we start addressing these waste management challenges moving forward. In terms of impacts, we're seeing increased leakage of waste. As again, plastic is an excellent indicator. We're seeing increasing leakage of plastic waste into the aquatic environment, into our rivers, into our oceans. The study certainly by Jambek and colleagues for the African continent starts to highlight where some of those hotspot areas are in terms of inadequately managed waste, and where we expect to see growing issues around the leakage of plastic waste into the environment. Those hotspots, again, are kind of around West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, in the north around Egypt, and certainly in the south around South Africa. So again, there's a very strong signal that is being sent to us to say we have to be dealing with these issues now, because we're expecting to see significant increases in plastic consumption and plastic wastage in the future. We also know that this leakage of waste into the environment creates further risks of disease, where we have stagnant water sitting, for example.
Alors, nous avons la question des eaux stagnantes.
Stormwater canal, and that very often results in flooding within our cities and towns, and it also results in broader environmental pollution. Another issue that is common across Africa, and again not unique to Africa, we see this in many developing countries around the world, is this issue of open burning of waste, including plastic waste. Very often these dump sites catch alight, whether it be accidental or intentional, and this leads to significant air pollution. We know the risks of open burning of plastic waste, and the pollutants that generates, and the toxicity of those pollutants, with the potential to negatively impact upon human health. In terms of waste governance, how are countries responding to these growing waste management challenges? Well, we also see that there's very often an inability of government and also the private sector to keep pace with the amount of waste. You know, waste generation is growing so fast that our municipalities, our states, our provinces are struggling just to keep up with the amount of waste. And also in parallel to that, are struggling to keep up with developing appropriate policies and strategies to deal with that waste. And so because of this, we see this sometimes almost knee-jerk reaction to dealing with plastic in particular, where many African countries have now moved to banning certain plastic products. And certainly while that originally started off with things like carrier bags, we're seeing that now move into other single-use plastic products as well. We're also seeing African country governments being quite slow to adopt alternative policy instruments, things like economic incentives, tax incentives, extended producer responsibility, which can also be very useful tools in helping to address some of these waste management challenges. And I think, you know, when I see a photo like this, for example, I can understand why a government feels like there's no other solution to deal with plastic waste than simply to ban it. I can understand that. But the question is, we need to understand the intended and the unintended consequences of doing that, of taking this drastic action. The 2018 report published by UNEP showed that 29 countries in Africa had already implemented some sort of regulation against plastics, whether that be a regulation on the ban of single-use thin plastic bags or a complete ban on carrier bags. But as I mentioned, we're starting to see these bans trickle over into other single-use plastic products, things like PET beverage bottles, in the food services industry, things like straws, cups, the clamshell, takeaway food containers, your plastic knives and forks and utensils. So we're seeing this growing ban around single-use plastic on the continent. Certainly, the Breaking the Plastic Wave study that was published last year shows us that there's no single solution to dealing with plastic waste. It's going to require a suite of different interventions. It's going to require reduction, which is where we see the space, for example, for product bans. It's going to require substitution to other material types. It's going to require growing recycling on the continent. And absolutely, it's going to require us transitioning from these uncontrolled and controlled dump sites to proper engineered landfills for that last bit of residual waste. So it means that as a continent, as countries on the continent, we have to be looking at solutions in all of these areas, in reduction, in substitution, in recycling, and in safe disposal, if we are going to reduce the amount of plastic that is leaking into the environment. This issue of appropriate solutions is really so important, because very often we see technologies from elsewhere in the world being dropped into Africa. And sometimes those technologies are just not appropriate for what we need to do, or given the specific conditions that we work with in Africa. We've seen many social and technological innovations emerge from within Africa, which is fantastic to see. These are homegrown solutions to dealing with our waste challenges. But we've also, unfortunately, seen that the uptake of alternative waste treatment technologies has been very slow on the continent. And what the recommendation that is put forward in the Africa Waste Management Outlook is in fact, we need a combination of solutions. We need a combination of small scale, low cost, decentralized, community-driven initiatives. And we also need larger scale, higher cost, centralized initiatives. We're going to need a combination of both of those. That can be a particular challenge for plastic waste. It works very well with organic waste in terms of decentralized composting, for example, but a particular challenge around plastic waste management. So again, we have to be finding appropriate solutions that will work for African countries to deal with plastic waste. And then this issue around the financing of waste management. The key issues that we find from the outlook is that there is poor financing of waste management on the continent. One of the major reasons for that being that the waste sector is seen as a high risk investment. The figures are also incredibly high. The investment needs that we've calculated to implement appropriate technologies ranges somewhere between 6 and 42 billion US dollars. But obviously there is opportunity to unlock revenue from that through things like recycling or through waste to energy. And one of the messages that we give in the outlook as well is that public-private partnerships are critical to unlocking these opportunities. We know that governments cannot do this on their own. They do not have the financial resources. They do not have the infrastructure that's needed to do this. So public-private partnerships really, really are important to addressing the waste management challenges and equally the plastic waste management challenges. So the Africa Waste Management Outlook asks us to do two things. It asks us to bring waste under control on the continent, and it asks us to harness the opportunities of waste as resource. So what do we mean by these two things? The first one, in terms of bringing waste under control, it's critical that as a continent, we improve the levels of basic city cleansing, waste collection, and safe disposal. This is the foundation of any integrated waste management system. Keeping our cities and our towns clean, making sure that there is regular and reliable waste collection services, and that that waste that is collected is sent somewhere safe for disposal. The Breaking the Plastic Wave report again calls for a scaling up of collection rates, particularly in low and middle income countries, to at least 90% in urban areas and to at least 50% in rural areas by 2040. So this is a big ask if we are to solve the plastic waste problem. And as you can remember from one of the previous slides, we said that as a continent, we're sitting at around 55%, but that figure varies from less than 20% in some countries to higher than 80% in another. So there is a lot of work to be done of just simply bringing waste under control. It means that we also need to bring more households into waste collection systems. It's a staggering figure if you look at it globally. We need to bring 4 billion people into waste collection, 500,000 people a day, every day of the week between now and 2040. That's internationally. That's across the world. Obviously, a smaller figure for Africa. But we really need to be making sure that households have access to regular and reliable waste collection systems. The second point is around harnessing the opportunities of waste. And this is this paradigm of waste as resource. So how do we grow recycling? At the moment, recycling is emerging across the continent. It's still small. It's very much driven more by issues of poverty and unemployment and socioeconomic need than specifically by public or private sector design. As I mentioned earlier, the informal sector is playing an important role in this space, and they do it because they can earn a livelihood from the collection of these recyclables. As I mentioned before as well, only 4% of municipal solid waste is recycled in Africa, despite an estimated 70 to 80% of the waste generated in Africa being recyclable. So there is still a lot to be done to grow recycling on the continent. And as I mentioned, this issue around the informal sector, in Africa, we estimate that more than 70% of the recyclables that are currently collected are collected by an active informal sector. So again, how do we integrate our informal waste reclaimers into our waste economies? So having said that, in terms of how do we bring waste under control and how do we harness the opportunities of waste as resource, I think it's clear that Africa is facing many waste management challenges, as you've seen through the previous photos. Those challenges range from the first steps in terms of collection all the way through to the final disposal of waste. Unfortunately, the continent has been slow in terms of unlocking recycling opportunities. As I said, despite 70 to 80% of the waste potentially being recyclable, and these waste management failings are highly visible through waste streams like plastic. As I've said, plastic is an incredibly useful indicator to give you a sense of the current waste management challenges that a country is facing. So I don't believe we have a plastic waste management problem. I believe we have a waste management problem. And plastic is a useful indicator to show us where things are failing in the system. And so if we are to solve for the plastic waste management problem, we must solve for the underlying waste management problem. We can't try and do one, we can't try and solve for plastic without solving for the broader waste management problem as well. Thank you very much. And I'd be very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Linda. That was excellent. I'm sure that there will be questions.
Thanks, Linda. I don't see any questions yet. If anyone would like to raise any topics, please feel free to send those through in the question and answer box.
Alors, je ne sais pas si les... Bonjour, merci. Je commence par remercier notre conférencière d'aujourd'hui, le Dr Linda Godfrey. Je ne sais pas si les autres participants francophones ont finalement bien pu suivre, parce que j'ai vu dans les commentaires qu'il y avait eu quelques problèmes techniques. Merci de nous faire savoir si finalement ça a été résolu. En tout cas, nous avons pu bénéficier.
We were graced with these outstanding expose or presentation by knowledgeable experts in speakers in the person of Dr. Linda, that showcase a high level of expertise that can be harnessed by all of us. And there's a trend to think that our issues are limited or restricted to plastic littering, but she did do a great work showcasing how our governments are facing a broad waste management issue, and of which plastic littering is only an indicator. And as Dr. Linda Godfrey is here and she's still listening, let me say that you have kudos from the Abidjan Commission, and they would like to have some support for the elaboration or hammering out of an action plan for the management of these plastic management, leveraging on your expertise and experience from working the public sectors in South Africa, and scale up your experience and make your experience available to the entire continent. Alors, sur ce, je pense que nous avons...
Dr. Linda Godfrey.
Thank you very much.
There have been a few questions that came through, Linda. There's one that says, thank you so much for this presentation. Where can we find the African Waste Management Outlook documents?
So I see that in the chat box, the link for accessing the Africa Waste Management Outlook has been provided. So just scroll through and you should find the URL of where to access it. If anyone has a problem accessing, they can also just let me know. There is a summary document. There's a short summary document of the Africa Outlook, as well as the full document. And I believe that the document, the Outlook, has also been translated. So it is, as far as I know, it is available in both French and English.
Then there's another question that says, thank you for the great overview. Is the situation similar in relation to e-waste, or are there different hotspots and specific solutions needed?
Thanks, Thomas. It is different somewhat with regards to electronic waste. What we find plastic waste is, it's a challenge that faces all African countries across the continent, and almost equally so, irrespective of where you are in Africa. It's something that almost every household uses, and almost every household disposes of as well. And this has changed. 10, 15 years ago, we did not find plastic waste being generated in our rural areas, for example. But it almost doesn't matter where you go to now in a country, you'll find some type of plastic waste, whether it be a carrier bag or a plastic bottle or a plastic sweet wrapper or a plastic straw being generated. When it comes to electronic waste, we tend to find hotspots in Africa. And very often this is because of an issue of proximity. So we know, for example, that West Africa, again, Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, is a hotspot area in terms of very often illegal trade of electronic waste into that area, very often coming from Europe for disposal there. And there's a very active community that is dismantling the electronic waste. And very often we see developed countries saying, well, we send the waste to Africa because it creates jobs and it creates livelihoods for people. But I believe that, in fact, this is just an excuse. It's excusing the behavior of developed countries who, in fact, don't want to deal with their own waste management problems in their own countries. And so this issue of transboundary movement of waste is something that has to be addressed. And in fact, in the Breaking the Plastic Wave study, the assumption was made that plastic, in fact, could not flow from a high income to a low income country, because typically the receiving country just does not have the resources and the infrastructure to deal with that waste appropriately. So there absolutely are some differences between those two waste streams and the challenges that we face around them. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. There's another question that says, thank you for this excellent and comprehensive presentation. Do you know the reason why uptake of alternative waste treatment technologies is slow in Africa?
Thank you for that excellent question. There are a number of different reasons why that is the case. First, one of the main reasons is because dumping of waste is still too easy in Africa. Those photos that I showed you of uncontrolled and controlled dump sites, there is no gate control, there's no access control. Typically, there's also no cost involved to dispose. So why would anyone spend money putting in an alternative waste treatment technology when it is so cheap and so easy to dump? And so one of the things that has to be done is we have to address the disposal of waste, which includes transitioning to engineered landfills that comes with costs associated with it. It starts to make disposal more expensive, and suddenly these other technology solutions look more attractive. The other issue as well is that these are big infrastructure investment projects. And so very often where we don't have the right people, if we don't have, say, people who are skilled in waste technologies, they don't know what technology to invest in. So there's a lot of uncertainty around what technologies we should adopt. And we see this. We see a number of technologies, infrastructure projects that have been put up in Africa that are now lying dormant because it was just not the right technology to implement. So it's seen as high risk, and people are typically risk averse, and they know what currently works, and it's almost will continue with the current practice. And this is why it's so important to partner with the private sector, because what we find is that the private sector typically is able to bring new technologies into countries quicker and cheaper than what local governments, what municipalities or states are able to do. And they have a vested financial interest in doing that as well. Critically important, though, is that we also have to make sure, though, that private contractors are not necessarily bypassing government. Ultimately, waste management is a public health issue, and government is responsible for collecting and safely removing. It's very often it's written into the constitution of countries that it is a government responsibility. We often find where we have a failing in service delivery that private companies step into the void that has been created because of the failing in service delivery. And very often we see this where private companies or small entrepreneurs contract directly with households for waste collection. We see this quite often in Africa. The result, though, is that those that can pay will pay to the private company, but those that can't afford to pay will continue to dump their waste illegally. And by doing this, we're undermining government in terms of fulfilling its constitutional responsibility. So it's always important that we empower our cities and towns, our municipalities and our states to render the service. It's not to say they need to do it themselves, but they can do that in partnership with private companies. So again, there are a whole host of issues behind this, why we're seeing the slow uptake of technologies, but I think those are some of the key reasons that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's another question that says, do you know the project of Nzambi Matia from Kenya who transforms plastic into bricks?
Yes, we're seeing a number of these projects spring up, not only in Kenya, but in a number of African countries. And also not only just in terms of bricks, we see it being taken into roofing material, for example, roof tiles, paving stones into bricks, yes. Sometimes I'm in two minds about the projects, because it seems like an excellent use of the plastic now, of dealing with a plastic waste stream. But I also say we need to also think beyond just the now in terms of what happens to those products at the end of their life. So what happens to a roof tile or a brick or a paving stone that has plastic in it when it needs to be disposed of? Because now it's not just cement or sand, it now contains plastic as well. So I think the projects that we do put in place, we also need to think about the safe management of those new products as well at end of life. We're also seeing projects in terms of waste plastic in road construction. We've seen this also pop up in a couple of countries in Africa. And for that reason, we've actually funded in South Africa a research project to better understand this particular technology, to understand how much plastic waste could one incorporate into a road and what the potential risks are as well. Again, because what is the risk through just simply driving on the road of releasing microplastics into the environment? So as we speak right now, we have a demonstration project here in Pretoria where they've laid a section of road which contains a small amount of waste plastic, and they're currently busy with heavy vehicle simulation on that road to essentially simulate what it would be like to have heavy vehicles moving across that road surface. How does it perform, and what is the potential for plastic coming out of that road surface? So we see a number of these kind of innovative projects emerging to find solutions. But I think what we also need to be giving more attention to is we need to start moving upstream to look at things like product design, and also what our products are made of, and can we get products to consumers in a completely different way. So in those photos, for example, you saw a lot of the polystyrene takeaway containers. The question is, well, instead of finding a solution to deal with polystyrene takeaway containers at end of life, can we rather be working with the food vendors that are selling the food in these clamshells with incentives, like saying if someone brings their own reusable container, they'll get a discount on the price of the food that they buy. And this is being tried elsewhere in the world as well. So how do we actually reduce the usage of some of these products? There's also some great examples of alternative delivery methods. This issue around getting products to consumers in a different way. There was a pilot project that was trialed by Unilever, if I'm not mistaken, where you could bring your own reusable container and you could they would then fill it up for you with a washing liquid or shampoo or conditioner or different types of products that you would use in your house. So again, reducing the amount of plastic that is actually being consumed in the first place. So I think as a continent right now, we're very much focused on saying, well, can we create local recycling markets to deal with their waste? We're assuming that that waste is going to continue to be produced, and now how do we recycle it? I'm challenging you to say, well, how do we actually stop that waste from being generated in the first place? How do we reduce the consumption? And I believe there's a big opportunity here for Africa to do things differently. We don't have to follow the same route that developed countries have followed. There's an opportunity to leapfrog and to bring goods and services to people in Africa in a completely different way. And I believe that that creates significant opportunity for entrepreneurship and for small businesses to work together with consumers. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There were some questions that came through in the chat as well that said, congratulations on the presentation. Are there already successful examples in Africa of eco-organizations with the use of EPR?
Oh, great. So extended producer responsibility, EPR, is a very new policy instrument to Africa. It's been around for, well, 15, 20 years internationally. For those that are not familiar with the concept of extended producer responsibility, at the moment now, municipalities are responsible for waste management. So if I throw out a cool drink bottle, the municipality is responsible for collecting it. And the idea with extended producer responsibility is to say, well, no, in fact, the producer of that product has a responsibility to deal with it at end of life. So the whole point of extended producer responsibility is to try to reduce the burden on municipalities and on governments. So a number of countries in Africa are talking about implementing extended producer responsibility, but it's a very new policy instrument. We do have some voluntary EPR schemes that have emerged. For example, Petco South Africa, Petco Kenya have been set up to deal with plastic PET bottles at end of life. But I suspect we're going to see a lot more of these initiatives, whether it be voluntary or whether it be like in South Africa now, where we now have mandatory extended producer responsibility having put in place. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. There's another question that says, great presentation, thanks. It seems to be a gigantic effort to solve the waste management in Africa. So many things to do and behavior management takes time. My question is where to start? What would be your #1 priority?
Phew, putting me on the spot. So I don't think that there's only, one thing that needs to be done. But if you had to say to me where to start, obviously depending on the country, around somewhere between 40 to 80% of the waste generated in any city or town is organic waste. It's things like food waste or garden waste. And this is waste that can be easily composted. It can be easily sent to biogas to generate an anaerobic digester to generate biogas. So a good first starting point, once you can make sure that you can actually deliver waste services, is to put in just a simple wet and dry collection system. So collect the organic waste separately and collect the other waste mixed together, and that will include the plastic waste. The organic waste can be taken for composting, which can be used on farms, it can be used in gardens, and it can create revenue for a municipality. The mixed waste can then be taken to sorting facilities where you can use the informal sector, informal reclaimers, and you can separate out the plastic waste. But the reason why I said that, there isn't just one magic solution to deal with the waste problem is that it doesn't help to just separate and collect plastic, because then what do you do with it? Where do you send it? So at the same time, you need to be developing recycling markets that will take that material. And that means working with the plastic producers in the country to put money into creating those recycling economies. Now, for many African countries, they may not necessarily generate enough plastic waste to warrant investment in the technologies. And that's where we can look at what we've called regional economies. So let's say, for example, if Namibia doesn't generate enough plastic waste, it can send its plastic waste to South Africa, and we have a SADC regional economy until such time as a country starts to produce sufficient plastic waste itself. So those two main priorities of the outlook, bring waste under control, I think that is critical. Every city and town has to improve the level of waste collection. it's fundamental to what we're dealing with here. If we are going to solve the plastic problem, we have to make sure that we have waste collection and city cleansing in place. Again, the trick here is the ability of our municipalities to render those services. So how do we work with our municipalities to strengthen the capability, to make sure that they have the budgets to render those services? Because again, it's a bit of a downward spiral. As soon as a municipality fails to deliver a service, people don't want to pay for the service, which means that they can't render the service even more. So as soon as a municipality fails to render a service, it directly impacts on payment for services. And then the system starts to break down very quickly. So I think that there are a couple of things that need to be done, but certainly there's some low-hanging fruit areas where we can at least start to address these waste issues. And certainly, I think the one point that you mentioned in your comment there, this issue around behavior, education and awareness is also critical. People need to understand why good waste management is so important, whether that be people in government, people in business, or just general consumers like you and I, just residents and households. We have to be raising awareness that we can no longer accept the current levels of waste management. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's a question from Mohammed that says, great presentation. Talking about partnering with the private sector, what could governments do to help assist the waste sector and get the buy-in from the private banking sector?
Also a very good question. This speaks to the issue around financing, which really, really is critical. I think one of the starting points would be for municipalities, for example, to contract out, so to put out tenders for specific things, and they may look differently. It might be a tender for waste collection services. I go back to the point of saying, I would rather that the municipality put out a tender for a private contractor to collect waste than for the private contractor to contract directly with the household and bypass the municipality. So I think ultimately the municipality needs to be the one that is responsible for delivering the service, but again, it may not necessarily do it itself. This issue around raising the financing is also an important one. And in fact, it's something that's been looked at by a number of financing agencies around the world. Typically, these organizations have tended to invest in lower risk areas, in environmental areas like renewable energy, for example, water supply, road networks, etc. And very often, countries in Africa have had to rely on donor funding to invest in infrastructure. So you see donor funding coming in from let's say a European country. They invest in the construction of an engineered landfill site, and then they leave. They walk away. They go back to where they came from. And time again, we see that these infrastructure projects fail, and they fail for a number of reasons. They fail because the state or the municipality does not have the operational budget. It was never planned for. They don't have the operational budget to maintain that facility. And they don't necessarily have the knowledge in terms of how to run that facility. And you go back to that engineered landfill site 2 to 3 years later, and it's being operated like a dump site. So again, it's so important that if we are going to finance these, we finance them within the context of understanding the constraints that a government is facing in that city or in that town, and that we make sure that we're putting systems in place that are going to last and that are going to be sustainable. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. There was a comment in the chat that said, hello, do you have an evaluation model for the deposit of plastic waste based on the quantities produced, imported, and the life cycle?
Sorry, I'm not sure that I follow that one. Could you just repeat that, Tara?
So I think they're asking about an evaluation model for plastic waste that accounts for the quantities of plastic being produced and imported into a country, which takes their life cycle into consideration.
I'm not quite sure how to answer that one.
Perhaps.
Yeah, maybe the person could just provide a little bit more context, because I'm not quite sure from which angle to tackle that question. So apologies.
Okay.
There were quite a few things in that statement, so I just want to make sure I clearly understand what the person is looking for. Thanks.
Sure. Then there's another question that says, in Ghana, a company is converting plastic waste into pavement blocks, also into plastic lumber. Currently, a foreign company is converting PET bottles into industrial fiber. How will these countries be supported from a global fund to expand and remove plastics from the land so that they don't end up in the oceans or become marine plastic litter?
Yeah, so we see a number of initiatives like this. Plastic lumber, the plastic wood is also a common one that we're seeing, where the plastic is turned into park benches or into walkways, for example. We see this very often along beachfronts or in national parks. We see the plastic wood used quite often now. One of the things that, in fact, we were asked recently was, very often these products, when they stand in the sun, there's actually an odor attached to it, obviously with the heat of the sun on the plastic. And we were actually asked recently to evaluate what the potential risks were, because this came particularly from a play area where children were playing. And a lot of the wood in the play area was in fact plastic wood, and they wanted to know whether there was a risk to the health of the children that were playing there. And sorry, I went off track there, so I just need to find that question again so that I know. Okay, there we go. I think around this point around supported from a global fund to expand and remove plastics, personally, I would say, we shouldn't be looking to global funds to try and solve these waste management challenges that we face. I believe that we need to be looking for local solutions, and that's why it is so important. I would say, one of the starting points is to identify what plastic waste products are being generated in your country, and who the brand owners or companies are that are putting those products onto the market. So I'm just going to, PepsiCo, for example, Coca-Cola, these big brand owners, amongst a host of others, are putting products onto the market in these countries. And so a useful starting point is to have discussions with these companies to say, how do we jointly find solutions to deal with this plastic waste problem, so that we're not looking at and we're not hoping that somebody overseas, somebody outside of our country or outside of the continent is suddenly going to find the financial solution or the funding solution to deal with these. So I think if we're going to solve the plastic problems, we have to be doing this jointly. We have to partner with others. We have to partner with the brand owners. We have to partner with government to find solutions that are going to work. And I think so long as the objective is clear, and the objective for me is reducing the amount of plastic leaking into our environment through least cost to consumers and to government, then the question then becomes, what solutions do we collectively put in place to deal with that? Thank you. I hope that's answered the question.
Thank you, Linda. There's a question from Abdullah that says, we have examples of the reuse of plastic waste as construction material. Is this a viable economic model? Isn't it a paradox in that this activity will always need waste plastics as a raw material, which is not a detriment to the use of, not a deterrent to the use of plastics?
It's a very good question. That is that, people always say that as soon as you find a market to deal with waste plastic, you then have to continue to generate waste plastic to feed the monster, if you'd call it that. So there's never kind of an incentive to reduce the amount of plastic waste that is being generated. I don't think it's necessarily an either or. I think while we are finding solutions to recycle materials, we can at the same time be looking at how we put steps in place to reduce consumption. I think as Africa, you know, the amount of plastic waste that is being generated in Africa per capita is still significantly less than elsewhere in the world. So we have an opportunity to solve this problem now before it becomes very bad. So I think again, if you remember that one diagram that I showed, that it's going to require a combination of solutions. It's going to require reducing the amount of plastic on the market. It's going to require substituting plastic with other things like paper, for example, or moving back to glass very often, where we had products in glass originally. It's going to require growing recycling. And there's going to be some plastic waste, which in fact is just not recyclable. And again, there we need to be looking at how we redesign those products that they can in fact be recycled and that they don't just end up in our landfill sites. So it's going to require a combination of all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I think that's definitely a very, very good point. There's a question that says, what kind of technological alternatives to plastic could be made available in Africa to avert its continuous pollution that renders challenges to human health and the environment?
So I'm assuming there that the person is speaking around a substitution, so using something else as opposed to using plastic. And if I've interpreted that question incorrectly, then forgive me, please. But, you know, there's a lot of talk at the moment now around using things like biodegradable plastics. And many people say, well, biodegradable plastics is the solution to the plastic problem. We just need to make all plastic biodegradable and the problem is solved. But this is in fact not correct. First of all, just because something is labeled as biodegradable doesn't necessarily mean it is biodegradable. Very often it requires very specific industrial facilities to make it biodegradable. And also, if you think about the amount of raw material that would be needed to convert everything into biodegradable packaging, it's also not a sustainable model. So yes, there are certain products where it makes sense to transition them to a biodegradable alternative, whether it be biodegradable plastic, whether it be paper. And in fact, there's a research project currently being funded by UNIDO in South Africa to look specifically at this in terms of what products does it make sense. So if you remember some of the photos that I showed you, things like the disposable nappies, the diapers, there's a plastic component to that that could be converted into a biodegradable alternative. Things like agricultural plastics that are intended to stay in the field could also be converted into biodegradables. But we also at the same time, where I see perhaps the biggest opportunity for innovation is in the alternative delivery methods. So instead of buying your Pepsi in a bottle, you take your own bottle and you simply fill it up from a Pepsi refill station and you pay for the amount that you filled up. There's so many innovative examples like this that I think when it comes to alternative delivery methods, Africa could actually lead in terms of some of the innovative ideas to, as I said, to leapfrog what's currently happening in many developed countries. Thank you.
There's a question here in the chat. I have it translated from French, so I hope that I've preserved the essence of the question. But they're asking about, is there a need to broaden the scope of legal text drawn up? So I think they're referring to legislation surrounding plastics.
So again, the state of our waste legislation on the African continent varies significantly. We have some countries that don't have any specific environmental or any specific waste legislation in place. We have some countries that have environmental and waste legislation, but don't necessarily have specific plastic legislation in place. And I think certainly we should reach a point where every country in Africa has a piece of waste management legislation. I think, for me, I think it's critical that there is at least a common understanding across all of the African countries in terms of a regulatory framework. Because as I said, waste will always move from a country with strict legislation to a country with weak legislation. And that's why so many countries in Africa become dumping grounds. So I think that there's a lot more that can be done of putting correct legislation in place. Obviously, there's no point just having the legislation. Enforcement of legislation is critical. And so at the same time, we have to look at how we build enforcement capacity within countries, that we have environmental officers who are in charge of implementing those regulations as well. I know a number of countries, if I'm not mistaken, I think Nigeria has, Kenya has as well, have also looked at specific plastic regulations as well to specifically deal with plastic waste. And so certainly where plastic is identified as a problematic waste stream, it can make sense to put a specific plastic waste regulations in place as well. But we have a lot of gaps at the moment in our waste legislation on the continent, which need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. There's a question in the chat that's in the Q&A box that says, is there a global funding mechanism to support local initiatives to manage plastic waste and prevent them from entering the seas or the oceans? And if there is, how can it be accessed?
There are some initiatives that are emerging to deal specifically with plastic waste. I certainly am not familiar with all of them. I know that the World Bank has initiated some activities around plastic waste in some countries on the continent. So I don't have a detailed answer to that one, but I know that there are some big organizations that are specifically targeting plastic waste for interventions. I'm not sure if that's something that perhaps SST can assist with, the African Marine Waste Network can assist with in terms of maybe providing some of that information.
Thanks, Linda. There's another question that says, that refers to the biodegradable additives that you mentioned earlier. Do you agree with the use of oxo-biodegradable additives in the management of plastic films? If not, what are the reasons? And if yes, what are the benefits or not for the recycling industries?
That sounds like a very loaded question. My short answer to the issue of oxo-degradable is no. Personally, I'm not in favor of oxo-degradable. Essentially, as far as I understand, is that oxo-degradable products don't biodegrade, they just fragment into smaller and smaller pieces. So all that we do is we fragment plastics into microplastics, which remain in the environment. I know certainly the last I heard, the European Union was looking at stopping the use of oxo-degradable plastics within the EU region. So we do see a number of these products appearing on the market in Africa. It's again depending on the product itself, but they do have the potential to disrupt existing plastic recycling processes, because you can just imagine, let's say if you introduce an oxo-degradable carrier bag that you don't know is oxo-degradable into a normal recycling stream, you've potentially compromised that recycling stream as a whole. So, I don't know why we would want to go that route when we do know that there are fully biodegradable products that are also on the market. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. There's a question that says, thank you again for the brilliant presentation. How can we get governments to get more involved in the fight against plastic waste when we know that they are signing decrees and laws that they are unable to implement?
Yeah, and I think, thanks for that question. And, I think, again, this comes down to the ability and the capability of our governments, whether that be at the level of our municipalities in cities and towns, whether it be at our states or provinces, or whether it be at national government level. And I think, you know, these different levels of government are dealing with so many issues that they're trying to work on, and very often waste has a low priority. We see this across African countries, and sometimes it's understandable. You know, there are basic survival issues like access to healthcare, access to education, access to housing, access to security and safety. These are basic survival and livelihood issues. And so very often things like waste management, wastewater, roads tend to have a lower priority because there's limited budget to go around to dealing with these issues. So I think, you know, we really do need to be working with governments to build capability, to assist them in terms of, you know, raising the revenue that's needed to deal with waste, to raise the awareness around this issue, and to start to identify it as a priority. But there are always competing priorities that a government has to face. And again, for me, this is why the public-private partnership route is a particular area where government creates the enabling environment. It is the enforcer of the legislation, but the services themselves are rendered through a public-private partnership, through a private contractor who then invests in the infrastructure, invests in the fleet, in the technology, etc. So yeah, you know, I really do feel for our municipalities who are struggling to balance all of these different demands, while at the same time very often dealing with households and residents who are just not willing to pay for services. So where does the money come from to deal with waste management? Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. On that note, there's a question from Abdullah that says, you said in your presentation that the major problem is the financing of waste management in a global way. In the context of plastic waste, who should pay in the end? The industry, the public authorities, or the consumer?
Well, sadly, we know that at the end of the day, the consumer pays for everything. So even if we put things like extended producer responsibility in place that forces a brand owner to take responsibility for their product at end of life, the brand owner will always pass that cost down to the consumer. And we see this from international experience as well. You know, there's no consumer that's going to absorb that cost because it eats into their profits. And so that's why they look at what systems that they can put in place at the least cost, because the higher the cost of dealing with their product at end of life, the more expensive their product becomes. So I think sadly, unfortunately, we as the consumer are the ones that always bear that cost. But I suppose at the same time, it gives us the power to consume wisely. And this links to the issue of education and awareness, in that we also need to be teaching people to be responsible consumers. It's so easy just to buy something in single-use plastic packaging, and without even thinking to just throw it away, to drop it in a gutter or in a stormwater drain, and not to think about it again. But we have to create responsible consumers on the African continent, that they are educated to make the right decisions around what they buy, but also what they do with their waste when they don't need it anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There was a comment in the box that says, I believe that is well underlined, and it's globally a problem of waste management that we have in Africa, and not only the problem of plastic waste management. Is this why, to solve the problem of plastic waste in the marine environment, it would be important to seek a solution for the problem of waste management in general on the whole continent? And the problem of plastic waste is only one element that needs to be taken into account. It's a long message. Do you want to comment on that at first?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as I said, plastic is just an indicator. It's just one part of our waste stream. And so if we see plastic in the environment, we normally see other types of waste in the environment as well. The problem with plastic is that it stays in the environment for a long time. So the food waste, the garden waste, the paper will eventually biodegrade in the environment, and we won't see it anymore, but the plastic stays there for a long time. And so that's why it kind of, it has been this indicator. But absolutely is that, you know, we can't just solve the plastic problem because we're only solving for that 13% of the municipal solid waste stream. But there's a whole lot of other waste that is also not being managed properly. And so that's why I believe that we have to solve for waste management as a whole. And plastic is part of that, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. The comment goes on to say that it's important to integrate the inland countries and not just the coastal areas of the Abidjan Convention in order to have interstate synergy. And it should be noted that a large part of plastic waste in the marine environments comes from non-coastal countries.
Mm. Yeah, you know, this is something very often that we struggle with when we try to do education and awareness in inland countries, is people say, well, I don't live anywhere near the sea, so what if the plastic's getting into the ocean? Or I don't eat fish, so what if the plastic is getting into the fish? There's this level of removal from the problem. But you're absolutely correct in that, you know, it flows into our oceans through our rivers, and very often this is coming from inland countries as well. So it's, again, it speaks to this issue that we are not only trying to solve for the plastic in the marine environment, we're trying to solve for the plastic on land, we're trying to solve for the plastic in rivers, and ultimately we're trying to solve for waste management. So, you know, as we've tried to address through the Africa Waste Management Outlook, we have a big waste management challenge ahead of us as a continent. And hopefully we've provided some guidance in the outlook in terms of how to address those waste management challenges. But we have to address them now. We don't have the luxury of time to wait and to debate and to argue about what is the best solution. We need to start putting solutions in place now if we're going to address our waste challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's a question from Abdullah that says, there's also the problem of responsibility of consumers and citizens in their daily behavior. Do you think that a policy to encourage selective sorting is conceivable in our African countries?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I followed that one. Could you just repeat that, Tara?
Do you think that a policy to encourage selective sorting is conceivable in African countries? Abdullah, I'm not sure if you're referring to separation at source, encouraging daily, citizens to sort their waste as part of their daily behavior.
That's the way that I interpreted it, was to put to get households to separate their waste at source. I think that there is opportunity in that. You know, I don't think we're anywhere near, let's say, for example, you know, a Germany that separates into 7 different waste streams at source. I think that, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think what I would like to see is that we focus on separating out a clean organic waste stream, so the food waste and the garden waste, and leaving all the other waste in a mixed recyclable, in a mixed waste stream. But that mixed waste stream is now dry, so it's not contaminated with the food waste, and it's not contaminated with the garden waste. That mixed stream can then go somewhere for further sorting and for recycling. But I think, given the fact that our organic waste stream is so big in most African cities and towns, is that for me the priority would be to say, collect a clean organic waste stream and take that somewhere, which means you're potentially removing somewhere between 40 and 80% of your municipal waste. And it then means that you have a much easier mixed waste stream to try and deal with. But to try and get households to now separate out into paper, plastic, glass, metal, food waste, etc., is just too much to do too fast, too soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's another question in the chat that says, how can we estimate the evolution of the quantities of plastic waste? And are there any models? I'm not sure if any of these have been updated since the 2010 and 2050 projections.
Good question. I don't have an answer for that one. I think the Water Waste 2.0 report undertaken by the World Bank, if I'm not mistaken, looked at this. The Breaking the Plastic Wave study also looked at per capita waste generation for low income, middle income, high income countries. So I think there's some guidance in terms of what we typically see per capita in terms of plastic waste generation, depending on the type of country that you're in. And I think it's a useful starting point, but obviously the best is actually just to undertake, waste characterization studies and to look at the amount of plastic that's actually being generated. As I said, on average for the African continent, we said it was at 13%, but again, that varies from city to town, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's a question in the box that says, talking about lack of knowledge and ability to maintain engineered landfills, thereby reducing them to dump sites. What is your expert view and recommendations on how to mitigate the challenges?
Mitigate the challenges of what, sorry?
In terms of the degradation of engineered landfills into dump sites.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, so the point that I mentioned around how we have investment in an engineered landfill and then you go back 2 or 3 years later and they're operating like dump sites. I think for me, it's around empowering the municipality, and that's why I'm not a big fan of donor funding, where the funds are given to investing in the landfills, in the engineered landfill, and then they walk away. I would prefer to see a model where the municipality in fact borrows, it may be at an interest-free, but they borrow the money to build the engineered landfill site, because the simple fact of having to repay it makes them accountable to having to generate revenue to repay that loan. And so the reason I say that is because you can operate a viable engineered landfill site if you have gate control with a weighbridge and you are charging for the disposal of waste. So you can generate a revenue through the disposal of waste to the landfill, and that revenue helps you, it helps cover your operational expenditure, like daily compaction and cover and the next cell development and diesel for your vehicles on the site, the payment of your staff. So what we often see is that where someone else has just built the landfill, the engineered landfill site, there's no ownership of it, and so they don't collect revenue at the gate. There's no payment for disposal because there's no obligation to pay back any kind of loan. And so because they don't budget for an operational budget, they just don't have the money for the diesel, for the compactor, and they don't have the money for the staff at the gate to manage gate control. So I prefer a model where municipalities actually borrow the money, or through a public-private partnership, the private contractor borrow the money, so that there's some level of accountability to make sure that it actually is operated correctly. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's a question that says, thanks for the presentation. Transboundary transport of recyclable waste also represents an opportunity for increasing recycling rates regionally, taking advantage of infrastructure available in neighboring countries and economy of scale with larger quantities. How do you ensure that regulation banning transboundary transport of waste doesn't undermine recycling efforts in neighboring countries or in the region?
Yeah, I think, this is a question that we're kind of struggling with. And I think it goes through a progression in that very often there's sufficient local production of plastic before you need to start looking outside of the country. And then what happens is that the recycling infrastructure grows, and then suddenly you need additional plastic as well. And so you start bringing plastic in from other countries. And then you hit a point where with what you have left in your own country is poor quality, it's dirty, it's far away, so the costs of getting it to the recycling facility is high. And then unfortunately what we see is that recyclers will then tend to go and find their plastic outside of the country before putting steps in place to deal with the difficult to recycle in your own country. And I think that's something that we have to be very careful of, is that first and foremost, you have to be dealing with your own local plastic production. So yeah, so I think that there is a place, as I said, you know, through these regional economies, there is a place to create the economies of scale, to invest in the large recycling infrastructure. But I think at the same time, one has to be very careful that the recyclers aren't just cherry picking the good quality stuff from elsewhere and forgetting the locally produced plastic. Thank you.
There's another question that says, thank you. Please, what is your opinion on the banning of single-use plastic films that are less than 50 microns in thickness and are difficult to recycle? Is it a path you would encourage for African countries to take? And if not, what are your reasons?
Sure, again, a very loaded question. I'm always nervous about product bans because sometimes they can be a knee-jerk reaction to a problem. And we can sometimes see that there are unintended consequences of doing that. So I tend to look at bans as a last resort. If a country, for example, has tried every other possible alternative, you know, if they've worked with the producers and there's just no solution, then, you know, yes, sometimes a ban makes sense. You know, I think that producers also have a responsibility now. You know, I showed you the diapers, the used diapers. I believe that producers need to be able to show that, in fact, there is a solution for their product at end of life before they are allowed to put a product onto the market. And if they cannot show that, then the question is, well, should you be allowed to have your product in our country? So as I said, I'm nervous about bans, but there are instances where I believe where it does make sense. You know, perhaps one of the most logical for me is the microbeads, the plastic microbeads in cosmetics. For me, it makes absolutely no sense to have them. We know that certainly in developing countries, wastewater treatment works are not able to extract those plastic microbeads. And frankly, I don't know who ever thought it was a great idea to put little pieces of plastic into different household or cosmetic products. So yeah, there certainly are some single-use plastic products where a ban does make sense, but I think one has to understand the potential unintended consequences of doing that. And I think perhaps one of the biggest you know, potential consequences for Africa is this issue around access to safe food and to safe water. These are, again, two priorities for the continent. We know as well that we do unfortunately have failing water supply systems. We have water supply systems that are compromised. You know, we do have outbreaks of different waterborne diseases. We have a continent with high levels of malnutrition, of high levels of hunger. And again, it's around getting safe food and water to people. And if sometimes that means that we need to use single-use plastic products to do so, then I think, you know, that's a price that we need to pay. But then we need to make sure that we have end-of-life solutions to deal with those products. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There are two more questions. The one says, in what extent do you think the pandemic worsens the problem of plastic waste management and waste management in general in Africa?
Sure. Good question. You know, I'm not sure if we've yet fully seen the implications of it. Certainly it has the potential to disrupt things like reuse, you know, where there is a fear of potentially, you know, reintroducing the novel coronavirus into certain situations. We're seeing it in terms of increased amount of PPE, of the masks and the gloves, which again, just, you know, because of poor human behavior, lack of education awareness, you know, we see these, you know, every week I see somewhere a mask that has been dropped or gloves that have been dropped. So certainly in terms of the PPE, we are seeing an increase in use of these and an increase in dumping. I always try to encourage people to use reusable masks if they can, as opposed to, again, just single use. So I think the starting point is always to say, how can we implement a reuse option before we have to revert to a single-use plastic option? And certainly, you know, I think that's my position, at least in life, is to try and reuse where we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's a question from Fiona that says, thank you so much for your presentation. Regarding transboundary movements of plastic waste and the closing of the Pacific Asian borders to plastic waste imports, there have been NGOs and news outlets raising it as a concern that this will or is leading to plastic waste imports into Africa, which you touched on in your presentation. Is there reliable evidence of this happening currently, or is it more of a fear for the future?
I think it's a little bit of both. You know, we saw that when China closed its doors, we saw some of the waste then making its way into Malaysia, the Philippines, into India, for example, and some of these countries then started sending the plastic waste back again as well, and also closing their borders. But we have already seen evidence of dumping of plastic waste into Africa. I mean, even in South Africa, we've had requests for plastic waste, and fortunately in South Africa we have quite strict import controls, and there is close engagement with our plastic industry. So the government department responsible for issuing those import permits first checks with our plastic industry to say, do you have spare capacity before, you know, we'll accept the import of this material. But, you know, this is particularly problematic for coastal countries, you know, because it's, you know, there's with a port, if there isn't necessarily strict control at the port, we already see evidence that plastic is finding its ways onto the shores of Africa. And again, yes, some of the plastic may be recyclable, and yes, we can generate some jobs and some livelihoods from it. But again, there's a lot of the plastic that, in fact, you know, it's dirty, it is not recyclable, it is problematic, and then it just simply finds its way into our environment. So you know, I think we need to be very, very careful around this going forward, because, you know, there is the potential for this to get a lot worse in the short to medium term. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. There's a comment relating to plastic turning into fuel and energy that says one of the best technologies in the management of plastic waste is the transformation of plastic waste into fuel or energy. Why are countries and sub-regional organizations not moving in this direction to set up large quantities for transforming plastic waste into energy? Is there a particular problem with this technology, or why until today is this underexploited even in developed countries?
So the short answer is that it's just not economically viable. There have been a number of pilot projects that have been set up of plastic to fuel, and very often these technologies require free access to the plastic waste. So the entire economic and business model around processing the plastic waste means that waste needs to arrive at the facility at zero cost, whereas with mechanical recycling, normally the recycler pays someone for the plastic. And certainly the models that I've seen, as soon as someone demands payment, it just makes the whole operation a non-starter from a financial perspective. We're also seeing evidence that waste to fuel and things like chemical recycling also has a great carbon footprint and carbon impact. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, mechanical recycling is still a preferred option to chemical recycling or plastic to fuel. But I think at the moment now it's largely just that it's an economic one, in that most of these are just not economically viable. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I think we are running out of time. So if anyone has any remaining questions, please feel free to bring those up at the next session. Tony, would you like to, can I hand over to you to do a bit of a closing? In the meantime, thank you so much, Linda. I think we've really picked your brain this afternoon. But thank you so much for all the thorough answers and the and all the elaboration.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Linda, thank you very much indeed for that marathon session. It's really exciting to see the interest that has been caused in terms of the questions and answers and suggestions and the thought that people are putting into this. And as Tara has just said, there are going to be panel discussions in this program going forward, including having Linda Godfrey on the panel. So please save your questions and think of other questions for the series of panel sessions that we're going to be having. This is an excellent start to the more technical side. So Linda, to you, thank you very much indeed. To all of those who've been in attendance, tell your friends and colleagues about the amazing quality of these presentations. More is to come, and we expect more people to join us. So to all of you, have a very good evening. Thank you. Go safely and stay well.
Thank you, Tony, and thanks again, Linda. For everyone, we hope to see you again on Tuesday for the next session. That'll be Tuesday, the 9th of March. The same link that you used to register for today's session can be used again to register for the panel session on Tuesday. Thank you, everyone.